To my right is John Dittmar. He's Director of Safety Security at North Carolina Port Authority. John has been in that position since April of 2017, reporting to the Executive Director. Mr. Dittmar is responsible for developing, implementing, and upholding the highest levels of safety and security with Port of Wilmington and Port Morehead City. Mr. Dittmar oversees the Safety Department in North Carolina Port's Police Department. He has over 20 years of safety and security experience working on board ships and in ports located in Washington, Maryland, Alaska, Pennsylvania, and North Carolina. Prior to joining the port, he spent 21 years serving the United States Coast Guard. During his military service, he worked extensively in maritime safety and security with a strong focus on domestic and international shipping. Mr. Dittmar led teams in response to national contingency operations, including 2010 Haiti earthquake and Deepwater Horizon oil spill. Mr. Dittmar holds a bachelor's degree in government affairs in government from the United States Coast Guard Academy, earned his master's in public administration from the University of Alaska Southeast. John can speak regarding military cargo as he's retired Coast Guard and one in charge who works in military in all cargo moves into North Carolina ports.
Thank you, sir, for that kind introduction. I actually also am in standing in for my boss, whose daughter's graduating from college, so Mr. Paul Koza sends his regards, and I'm very happy to be here and honored to be a part of this forum. I think there's a lot of good discussions going on. When I hear challenges, I think of an opportunity to excel. I think some of that goes back to my military career, but also with the baseball analogy we've heard of pitching and catching, the challenge is when you get that curveball. So I'm going to talk about two challenges we have faced last year and one we are currently facing. But a brief summary of North Carolina ports. We are, in fact, a state port authority. We are mandated by our legislature to operate as a business. And our General Assembly has been very kind in funding us annually to the tune of $45 million for capital improvement projects, which we are currently and plan to continue carrying out. This includes taking delivery of our third Neo-Panamax crane here very recently. We're also taking delivery of a mobile harbor gantry crane in the Port of Morehead City later on this summer. And we clearly want to meet all of our customers' needs, and this includes the U.S. military. We're roughly a 1 hour's drive distance from Fort Bragg and Camp Lejeune, respectively, for the ports of Wilmington and Morehead City. And both of these ports are served by rail, and we also have on-dock rail, so we're very versatile. We also are co-located, and we share a waterway with Military Ocean Terminal at Sunny Point. So there's a lot of synergy going on in North Carolina. But I want to briefly discuss these two challenges that I outlined earlier. I raise these challenges because I believe there are parallels to all of us here in this room, our respective organizations, both industry and the military. And I want to set the stage, and I ask everyone to think about what Admiral Clark said. In facing these challenges, we need to be agile, flexible, and resilient. And the first challenge was Hurricane Florence last year. It's been brought up, and it's still very real in what we deal with as far as the damage that was sustained to the state, the loss of life, and how we learn from the lessons of that hurricane. It was projected to make landfall as a Category 4 and had max sustained winds of 130 miles per hour. And in the midst of all of this, we had a military operation going on that we were going to meet mission. And working closely with our 841st unit and the leadership there, we worked very hard until the very end to get that ship loaded, get it safely out to sea. And unfortunately, there were some boxes that were left over that when we reconstituted the port, and keep in mind, major interstates were totally flooded. I-95, I-40 were impassable. I actually had to fly in with my boss via aircraft before the airport even opened to commercial traffic. So we were dead set on meeting mission, both of the military, but also getting the port back open. So I want to thank Major General Farman for personally visiting the port post-hurricane. He basically let us know how important the mission was and thanked us for our hard work. And that meant a lot to us as a port authority, especially the people that were there when their homes were destroyed and their families, they're trying to figure out what they're going to do, but they were there at work getting the port back together. So I also want to touch on the other challenge that I think that we all face, and that's loss of corporate knowledge. We have a senior port operations manager who just announced recently that he's retiring in 2 months, and he's got 45 years of experience at the port, but also experience serving the military as one of our customers. So I put that out there because I think that's a challenge we all face as people leave organizations, but know that there's people waiting in the wings. You know, I see the young officers and the young members of industry here, and I think that's encouraging because they're hearing the challenges that we face, and they are ready and waiting in the wings to help us tackle those challenges. So with that, I'll take any questions at the end of the panel. Thank you.
Next up, Bill Paape is Director of Office of Maritime and Intermodal Outreach from the U.S. Department of Transportation Maritime Administration. Bill's a native of Madison, Wisconsin, brings a diverse strategic surface transportation, intermodal logistics, and terminal operations background to the United States Department of Transportation's Maritime Administration. A career U.S. Army Reserve officer, Bill was appointed as the director of the Office of Gateways in August 2015. The Gateway offices provide critical maritime transportation outreach activities to our major U.S. gateway ports, with offices in 10 of the largest ports in the East, West, and Gulf Coast, the Great Lakes, and inland river systems. The Gateway offices are the agency's day-to-day presence throughout the maritime transportation system. From July of 2011 to July of 2015, Bill served as Director of Inland Waterways Gateway Office. The Inland Waterways Gateway area's responsibilities include portions of 15 states adjacent to the navigable rivers, to include the Upper Mississippi River, the Missouri, the Illinois Waterways, and the Ohio River. Focus areas include shallow draft, inland marine transportation, inland ports, inland intermodal issues, and inland marine security. Bill received his U.S. Army commission in May of 1982 from the University of Wisconsin, Stevens Point, through the Reserve Officer Training Corps. He served active duty from 83 to 94 in a variety of company and battalion level assignments, to include tours with the 25th Infantry Division of Schofield Barracks, Hawaii, 29th Infantry Regiment of Fort Benning, Georgia, and the 1st Special Warfare Training Group of Fort Bragg, North Carolina. He received a commission in the United States Maritime Service in September of 94 and served on the staff of the Commandant's Office and the Adjutant Facility member as the United States Merchant Marine Academy in Kings Point, New York, through September of 2001. Mobilized after 2011, Bill served for the years 2001-2002 at Fort Eustis as commander of the Deployment Support Detachment for Military Traffic Management Command, providing deployment assistance and strategic transportation planning to various installations throughout the United States and their respective strategic seaports in support of Operation Enduring Freedom. Bill also provided deployment support expertise for barge movements out of Germany. His other key assignments include command of a detachment of soldiers and Coast Guardsmen in Kuwait, command of the 457th Transportation Battalion in Minnesota, command of the U.S. Army Port Opening Element of the U.S. Transportation Command's Joint Task Force, port opening in New Jersey, and director of the Exercise and Future Operations Division of the U.S. Army Military Surface Deployment and Distribution Command in Illinois. He has a bachelor's degree in cultural anthropology from University of Wisconsin, Stevens Point, a master's degree in international relations from Troy State University in Troy, Alabama, a master's degree in procurement and acquisitions management from Webster University, and a master's degree in strategic studies from the United States Army War College. Bill and his wife Peggy have 4 daughters, 3 grandchildren, and maintain a permanent residence in Shiloh, Illinois. Welcome.
Thank you for that kind introduction, and my apologies. I probably should have thinned that down a little bit, but I appreciate it. So what he said is I'm the Army guy in Marad, and so they have fun with me and I have fun with them, so who? I'm going to talk just a little bit about the gateways because I think that's relevant to what we're supposed to get after here today. So if you think of the 10 one-person gateway offices throughout the United States, it's really, as it pertains to strategic ports, it's an economy of force mission. So Kevin Tokarski and his team don't necessarily have the resources to do everything with everybody everywhere, and so we try and help out. But our primary mission is commercial port infrastructure development and moving cargo, getting cargo on the water, short sea shipping, or the Marine Highway Program for that service development. So we do a lot of other things as value to the organization, to the department. But when you have developed your relationship with your respective gateway as a strategic port, you may have somebody who's a retired service member, or a retired Navy captain, or a Coast Guardsman, or an Army guy. Or you may have somebody that has a background in community planning, or a former rail conductor. So we have a very diverse mix of experiences and skill sets because our mission set dictates that we provide that blended background to support the commercial ports. So I share that with you because as you develop your relationship with your gateway, who hopefully will add value as you pursue your strategic port mission, it's okay to tailor what you tell them or how you tell them, how you communicate with them so that they can be of added value to you. So just something to keep in mind. Most of the gateway directors are here. If you're a gateway director, if you'd stand up. Now's your chance to look at a real live gateway director. If you're, okay, thank you, you can sit down. If you're a port, you already know who your gateway director is. But if you're not, during this conference, this is an opportunity for you to talk to a gateway director and ask them what do they do, and maybe what could they do for you. And if they can't do anything, they'll let you know. But usually they'll share with you some ideas. One gateway director that's not here is Bob Loken. He was the Seattle or Pacific Northwest and Alaska gateway director. He's retired, and his job announcement should be out in the next 2 weeks or so. And I would just encourage qualified applicants to please apply. So as it pertains to strategic ports, what do gateway directors do? Well, I like to think of it as we try and add value to that relationship between SDDC, Transcom, and the port, and the other stakeholders, and particularly to develop a relationship and help as we work with the Coast Guard. So we support the NPRN, and we try and shepherd those port assessments and get those things posted, but also to make sure that they're full of accurate and quality content. We participate in PRC meetings and try and add value there. And so if you're an incoming commander or a part of the incoming leadership team, a gateway director is a good person to have a friendship call with because they've probably been there for 5 or 10 years and may be able to tell you a little bit more about the lay of the land. So they're also that continuity piece, if that can help you. And they also discuss, as I mentioned earlier, about federal assistance programs and strategies to try and garner those. We're going to talk a little bit about the oversubscribed federal assistance programs, but certainly being a strategic port doesn't hurt you as you compete for those dollars. One of the things the reason that you have such a strong presence here of the gateway directors is it's our version of trying to get off the spot a little bit, do things a little bit differently. I brought in 2 gateway directors that don't have strategic ports because I think it's important to build depth, build the bench, if you will, so that if you're in need of assistance and it's something we can help with, that we have somebody other than the one gateway director if you need additional assistance. The annual Gateway Summit this year is going to be in Beaumont, Texas. So we thank the Port of Beaumont and Port of Port Arthur and others for putting up with us. But that's, I think, important for us to have a collective discussion at a strategic port. We're working to improve our collaboration with the NPRN community and develop a closer relationship with our friends in the Strategic Sea Lift Office so that we can better add value to their mission set as well. We're looking at increased exercise play. So if you think there might be a role for a gateway director as part of your mobility exercises or exercises at the port, let me know, and we'll see if we can't try and participate in some form or fashion for everybody's mutual benefit. I would ask you, what else could the gateway directors be doing for you? It's an open-ended question. I'm sorry. Okay. So back to the forum. So there's these 18 federal agencies that were touched on on the slide on the left for yesterday. I want to focus more on what's going on today. If you look at the port infrastructure development grants that compete for federal funds, about 10% of available funds go to ports, averaging 8% of all the modal applications, so we do fairly well. given that percentage. In the next two bullets I want to focus on is movement to recognize 8 types of port facilities and an effort to harmonize federal collaboration as it pertains to ports. So again, 18 federal agencies touch ports. So we're working, I'm going to share with you, I think the next slide, a GIS project. There are other GIS projects out there. We're working closely with the Corps and some other federal partners to try and figure out a better way to harmonize our efforts. And we're using core data, the doc data set, among others. We're contracted with ESRI right now, but that is evolving. And the reason that that is important is we frequently get asked to either testify or give background information to staffers or to other partners in DC, and they will think of ports as container ports. And so there's a big effort to increase the demand signal of what resources are needed for ports throughout the United States, to include strategic ports. And to do that, we had to work on messaging, quite frankly, and how do you, in 2 to 5 minutes, feed a lack of knowledge about the diversity of ports, the requirements of ports. And so we have a number of different initiatives to include the GIS effort. And then the last sort of inroad we've made on infrastructure as defined by the U.S. Department of Transportation is to expand that definition so that including intermodal connectors, both inside and outside the gate, and certain types of equipment are considered valid infrastructure investments. So this is just a snapshot of our earlier view and of our port typology dashboard. So we came up with 8 categories of ports. We know that ports can do more than one thing, but again, for the purposes of briefing those stakeholders I mentioned, we talk about break bulk, bulk goods, commercial fisheries, containers, cruise, marina and ferry services, or ports, energy, roll-on, roll-off, and spaceports. Spaceports have a supply chain, and that's an area that we're focusing on as well, and we're doing some work in that space here in Virginia. So if you think about it in terms of messaging, but then also think about it in terms of how can you rapidly zero in on the data sets that support those ports in order to tell a story, and again, the purpose being to increase the demand signal, the messaging of what the demand signal is for resources required for our nation's port infrastructure. So this is the 50-foot draft chart. So for a couple of years we heard we have to get to 50 feet. If I'd show you the 2016 version of the slide, there'd be no red dots, no deep ports in the Gulf. We now have a couple in there. Again, we don't dictate what depth ports want to go to. If they want to go to 50 or 55, that's certainly their prerogative. But from our perspective, we now have representation on all the coasts as it pertains to that capability. So you will frequently hear that, but I think we're at a point where the conversation can shift a little bit. So, next slide. Federal infrastructure for ports. Over $2 billion in federal and matching funds have been awarded to over 67 port projects in 34 states and 2 territories. 38 of those 50 states, of our 50 states, have navigable waterways. And as of January last year, January 18, 38 projects have been completed. About a third of those, or 22, were under budget of the original cost estimate. However, we have noticed lately that there's been a 40 to 140% cost increase in recent project bids. So that's something that we're closely monitoring. And just so you know, it takes about 7 years on average for a grant project to be closed. And then I threw this chart up, and one of the panelists earlier talked a little bit, and I'll mix it up a little bit, about the impact of energy ports. And so you see the graph in the upper right, and the bottom graph really just demonstrates, and you know this, the really the change in impact or the stress that energy is producing on our ports. And so the question becomes, what sort of impact or what sort of stress does that place strategic ports under, particularly as we talked about the different ways that deployments could occur, and is that a planning consideration? And then the upper left is really, again, an open question of the effects of alliances. And so you have alliances, carriers, and the remaining competition. And as you see, and again, you know this, the alliances starting to dominate that sector. What potential impact does that have, not only on our ability to use our strategic ports, but also what kind of investment dollars are flowing back into the ports as opposed to 5-10 years ago. So again, an interesting thought to ponder. So with that, I apologize for taking up so much time, and I'll pass it to Joel.
Thank you, Bill.
Tony.
Next up is Joel Valenzuela, Director of Maritime at the Port of San Diego. In his capacity, Mr. Valenzuela is in charge of operations, business development, and long-range planning for the port's cargo and cruise terminals, maritime industrial leaseholds for shipbuilding and ship repair facilities and other public-owned piers and docks in San Diego Bay. The Port of San Diego is also a strategic port offering facilities and services to the U.S. military. Prior to becoming director, Mr. Valenzuela was in charge of the port's Maritime Trade Development Group, the commercial business development arm for the cargo operations. Mr. Valenzuela holds a bachelor's degree in economics from the University of California, San Diego, and holds a master's in business admin and finance and a master's in public administration from San Diego State University. To you, Joel.
I feel like my bio is not long enough. So
By about a page.
I got to work on that. But seriously, thank you for the opportunity to speak to you today. Happy to also represent the California ports. I don't think there's any other California ports here, so remember that San Diego was the only California port here today. I think there's been a lot of discussion about the balancing act with regards to balancing commercial activities with respect to being strategic ports as well. And I think that's a challenge that the Port of San Diego has been very willing and eager to accept. It's been a welcome challenge. San Diego, as you know, is a military town with big Marine Corps and naval installations. We've been a strategic port for a very long time, so we've got plenty of experience in terms of military load-in and load-outs. And we take the designation very seriously. I like sharing this anecdote that a few years ago there was a developer-led initiative that was going to turn one of our cargo terminals into a football stadium. And had it not been for our strategic port designation, I would venture to say that would have happened. So the designation not only is, I think, important in terms of being good partners with the military, but also in terms of preservation of the port's existence itself. So that initiative was soundly defeated in the ballot because of our strategic port designation. So it's something that is kind of top of mind for us when we're working with the military in terms of serving that purpose. We are a niche port, so we're not one of the big mega container ports in California, which are LA, Long Beach, and Oakland. So our challenges, I feel, are quite unique from those other ports with respect to our ability to balance commercial and military activities, but at the same time also very similar. So I started putting together sort of in my mind a framework of what our challenges are as a niche port. We have non-containerized activities on the cargo side, but we also have very robust cruise operations. Our destinations are the Mexican Riviera because of our proximity, and it's a booming business that also needs sort of our attention in terms of being commercially viable. So the three buckets of challenges that I sort of thought about when I started thinking about the topic was, number one was infrastructure, the second one is labor, and the third one is just, I would call it planning and coordination. With respect to infrastructure, you know, as all ports are, very capital intensive, aging infrastructure. So we are faced daily with not just kind of being able to do things to modernize the facility, but also just the day-to-day challenge of maintaining the facility. So we have 2 cargo terminals. One is right in downtown San Diego, the 10th Avenue Marine Terminal, built in the 1950s. With a lot of sort of underutilized warehouse sheds. And one of the things we're doing is modernizing that with a project that demolishes a lot of these sheds. And thanks to MARAD and the formerly called Tiger grant program, we were able to get some money and matched it with port money to do that project. We're about 50% complete. And that gives us the ability to not just be more commercially viable, but also handle some of the demands when we have military activity at the port. Our other terminal is the National City Marine Terminal, which is a ro-ro facility. That has a private operator operating that terminal, but through our terminal operating agreement, we also make room for acreage, berth space, and rail capability for the military for that terminal. So with that facility, one of our major projects is improving rail capability. We are currently in environmental review for a connector track that would reactivate a rail storage facility to a main loop track in the terminal. It's currently under environmental review, and we're looking forward to that improving sort of the rail capability of that entire terminal. So we always have sort of in our minds infrastructure as one of the challenges, but also some of the opportunities to be able to serve the military. The second bucket that I thought of is labor. Being a niche port, we have a relatively small labor pool, if you will. The longshore workers, we have about 500 or so registered, and that includes casual workers. And so when we have a military operation, each shift could call upon as many as 60 workers, and these workers are called continuously for up to 2 weeks. And so it's a significant drain in terms of our ability to handle the cargo and cruise operations as well. And so a major challenge for us is kind of really making sure that these things are timed correctly so that we're able to provide both the military and the commercial requirements when necessary. So some of the things that we've kind of done is look at traveler situation with nearby ports, but also really working with the military to see if some of the workload could be handled by the military staff themselves to kind of ease the pressure on some of the longshore labor. So it's an ongoing process. It's a challenge for us, but we continue to work on it. And the third sort of bucket I just call sort of planning and coordination. A big part of our ability to be successful is really getting accurate information in terms of advance notice for military activity, but also accuracy in terms of deployment dates, move counts, because we rely on that information to be able to plan accordingly. And if the dates keep moving or the move counts are not correct, it really poses a greater challenge to be able to be effective during those situations. And details is just kind of really important in terms of planning. A lot of situations, there are third parties that need to be involved in these military movements, from custodial to people providing water to security guards, and just really kind of planning ahead and knowing what the requirements are going to be and we've learned this by trial and error through the years. It's really important in terms of tracking and being successful. And also kind of timing of trucks, rail, very important in terms of success. So those are kind of the three buckets that I sort of thought about, and we continue to refine some of these solutions for these challenges and work on these areas continuously. So thank you.
Last member of our panel is Jim Walsh, Senior Director of Operations at Philiport. Jim's been in his position since April 12th of 2004. Recently, Philadelphia Regional Port Authority has undergone a restructuring and rebranding. The PRPA, now known as Philiport, owns 10 marine terminals and 1,000 acres of real estate along the Delaware River. These properties are leased to private terminal operators to promote waterborne commerce and provide employment opportunities to the local community. In his new role as Senior Director of Operations, he is responsible for ensuring that the lease agreements between the authority and the terminal operators are adhered to. In addition, Mr. Walsh oversees the engineering, maintenance, and real estate departments. Prior to being hired by the authority, Mr. Walsh spent 9 years at Packer Avenue Marine Terminal, where he supervised the daily shipboard operations of one of the largest and busiest marine terminals on the Delaware River. During his time at Packer Avenue, Mr. Walsh gained an in-depth knowledge of the Philadelphia waterways, including terminal operations, labor management issues, and security procedures. Mr. Walsh attended the United States Merchant Marine Academy, where he studied marine transportation and earned a Bachelor of Science. During his time at the Academy, he sailed aboard the U.S.-flagged container vessels that called ports throughout Europe and the Caribbean. Mr. Walsh spent 10 years in the U.S. Navy Reserve, where he attained the rank of lieutenant. Mr. Walsh is a member of the North Atlantic Ports Association, as well as the American Association of Port Authorities, where he serves on the Operations Committee. He is also an active member of the U.S. Coast Guard Sector Delaware by Area Maritime Security Committee, Managing Board, as well as a member of the Port Security Grant Subcommittee. Jim?
Okay, thank you very much, and thank everyone for having me here. I'm part of this panel. It's a true honor to be here and tell you a little bit about our port and some of the challenges we face. I had a PowerPoint presentation before lunch, but during lunch, for some reason, I decided not to use it. It was banned at lunchtime, so. In any event, as I mentioned, I've been in the port industry. I've been in the Port of Philadelphia for 24 years now, and I've seen the port before the military came, while we were requiring the military, and now as a strategic military seaport. Early in my career at the Port Authority, I was a member of the AAPA. Kurt Nagel spoke this morning. One of the greatest phrases, at least someone told me a long time ago, Jim, if you've seen one port, you've seen one port. And that's no truer statement could be made, because every port, even these gentlemen here, we each have our own little differences in the way we operate day to day, and the challenges in how we deal with labor, terminal operations, et cetera. So yesterday, General Farman, he had mentioned a couple times this morning too about transparency. And in the port business, we're trained to positivity. We can do it, we can do this, we can do anything you want us to do, and we can. But it takes, a group effort of time and money and resources, but we certainly are a positive group, and we want to do that. But I think it is important. I learned this last year. We went through some construction projects at one of our larger terminals, so I list those on our port planning order. And, as I speak with MARAD and whatnot, they tell me, it's important that we have an accurate depiction of what we have at the port. It's not a mark against you if you put down on your port that you can't handle rail for 6 months, or you're under construction in your berth. It's a very important distinction, because ports in general are competitive in nature. They want to get that cargo. They want all the cargo to come to their port. So it's the transparency, I think, is an important part of this meeting, I think, here. And certainly, I have all the confidence in the world we can do anything the military needs us to do. At certain times, though, we are under construction and we have some limitations, and I think it's important to point those out and share those with the military. So a lot of people have been talking about labor all morning, and actually yesterday afternoon we got into the labor pool a little bit, and very interesting. So kind of along the lines of labor, and I'll speak, obviously just for the Port of Philadelphia, the throughput of the military or the activation of the military seaport really drives our labor pool and our training. In other words, the more freight we get through there, the more military cargo comes through the Port of Philadelphia, the better we're going to get at it. Yesterday I was talking to some people at one of the breaks, and I said, well, it's a pleasure to be here. I'm half a day back into the acronyms, and I'm starting to get retrained on the acronyms, and it takes me a little time to get back in the swing of the acronyms when you don't deal with it every day. And I think it's important that we realize that when we're talking at some of these panels and things, that not everyone may understand what exactly the acronym is, particularly from the port perspective. So I think the throughput, the experience that the men and women of the ILA in Philadelphia get on the equipment will increase their ability to be more efficient in loading it. And interesting, on our walk over to lunch, we were talking a little bit about that, and I always commend, anytime we do a military outload, we have contingent, the PSA, now I'm using the acronyms, but the Port Support Attachment comes down to the port, and they do the work of many men and women when they, a simple switch of a trailer or airlock brakes or something, they show our men and women of the labor force how to move that equipment along. And it was interesting, on the walk over to lunch, I was explaining that to someone, and they said, yes, but the better your labor gets, the less PSA we need to send. So those PSA assets can be used in other ports. So it's another great reason for us to train our labor. Many people don't understand in the longshoring industry, at least in Philadelphia, the labor's been trained basically through generations. Father to son, uncle to nephew, uncle to niece. And this has kind of been an on-the-job training situation. We're trying to formalize that now in Philadelphia, where we have a more formalized training program. We're working with some area community colleges. We're working with some large local sponsors. Citizens Bank has given us some money to do some training. We have actually a 15-acre training facility we're trying to open. Trying to, in some conversations I had at some of the breaks, I thought maybe we could get some equipment down from some of the military equipment so that we could train on it in advance of maybe the next exercise. Something to think about. I think training is a huge part of it, and I was surprised to hear when people talk about the port, so at least in Philadelphia, the different commodities operate on a different pay scale. So generally speaking, the higher, more trained personnel will go toward the container market more because it's a higher pay scale. So you can get down in, if you have 2 or 3 vessels in port, you can get down into the lower end of the labor force, so it's important that we train them. I also was talking about someone earlier, the newer members of the labor force also don't get paid to train. So it's a great opportunity for us to get them in there and get them trained. So training is definitely on our radar screen, and we're trying to stand that up within the Port of Philadelphia. A lot of what we've been talking about over the past day, the partnerships. So in the Port of Philadelphia, we're a landlord port authority, so we own all those assets along the Delaware River, but we lease them all to private terminal operators. We don't have the authority to go in there and dictate which area of that terminal is available for the military. So 2 of my partners are here from Delaware River Stevedores and Greenwich Terminal, Kurt Ferry and Bob Mulholland. They both joined me down here to support the effort. That's the kind of partnership we have. Every quarter when I receive our port planning order, I reach out to both of these gentlemen and I ask them, are you okay with this port planning order, the way I've written it, the way I've adjusted it? Because in the end, they're the entity that is going to have to provide that for the military. It's not me, it's them. They provide the labor. So it's a real partnership for us, and that's just the way we do it in our port, because for a number of years I was signing off on the port planning order and realized, I ought to have the terminal operators on board with this in the event something comes our way. So our partnerships are very important. We have very close partnerships with U.S. Customs Border Protection and the Coast Guard. The PRC meetings, we have them probably every 6 months to once a year. We probably should up that a little bit. I think with more throughput, that would certainly increase. Captain Carroll's comments this morning certainly hit home with me, and I think with a lot of people in the room. that we need to get labor to the table. We need to really take an interest in that meeting, and I give a damn. So I'll be at those meetings, and I want to make sure that goes forward. So the funding opportunities we heard about this morning is tremendous. We have actually, in Philadelphia, we're expanding. We're actually going to build a new berth south of our Packer Avenue Marine Terminal. So any funding opportunities that come up, as the Admiral mentioned this morning, there's a great opportunity for us to leverage those funding sources to support our strategic military seaport in the effort moving forward. But again, with that, I thank you for your time and attention, and I'm here for any questions anyone might have.
Any questions? Any questions, folks?
Hi, good afternoon. Lieutenant Colonel Jeremy Gottschall, 833rd Trans Battalion, Joint Base Lewis McChord, responsible for military outloads in the Pacific Northwest and Alaska. So you hit on a theme that's kind of dear to my heart, was we talked about labor and the challenges it can create. So we're fortunate enough to have our partners here from Jones Stevedoring, our SNRTS contract. So they kind of help us navigate, how shall I put it, I think it's a unique operating environment for labor where we're at. So this may be less of a question, more maybe a recommendation for the next time we do one of these, is perhaps invite our partners from ILWU, and I was at the ILA on the East Coast, to be a part of this, because from our experience, one of the things you touched on, Jim, was kind of the hierarchy of labor and their ability to choose what work they take. And so that's kind of something that we occasionally experience in the Pacific Northwest. And I don't know if that's common throughout both coasts and the Gulf Coast, but that'd be something I think that we could explore a little more. And Mr. Tokarski, is that right? So I'd like to speak to you, because you touched earlier about PMA, and this is another thing about training the labor force. And so it's something locally we're trying to look into, but if there's already resources we can tap into that could help do that, I think that would be a great readiness driver for the entire enterprise, because we often talk about readiness for our military units and our active component, the readiness of my Department of the Army civilian workforce, as well as our partners and reserve component. But I think sometimes we neglect to deliberately get after the training readiness of our civilian workforce, the stevedores, the longshoremen, which is not any way to say that we don't have a great labor pool up in the Pacific Northwest. We've done some outstanding work, and we've got some great partnerships. But I think it behoove us as a kind of a community and enterprise to integrate them a little bit more into the conversation. So, thanks.
Thank you, sir.
That was an easy question.
Look, can I just add, though, that that's a very good point. I think most ports strive to establish good relationships with the labor longshore union, ILWU in the West Coast, and the hiring counterpart, which is the Pacific Maritime Association. I think it would be a welcome opportunity if the military would also kind of step up and be part of the conversation, because I think that kind of emphasizes not just the challenge, but some of the opportunities for solutions to add, to the conversation.
I was waiting for the third base coach to give me the signal. So, Mr. Walsh, you brought up training, and this subject came up again. Just wondering, how much is live and virtual and constructive training, how useful is that in helping to educate or give more experience to the workforce? It's one of the things that I know many of the DoD services are really investing heavily in now. We've got littoral combat ships where the trainers there are almost as good as the ones we send our submariners to, and they can actually walk on board the ship and be functional within days of arriving. Is LVC something that would be of use in training the workforce?
Well, we in Philadelphia, so For those of you, the container industry has a funding source for funding of container operators and container cranes, reach stackers, and things of that nature. It's where you run into problems is in the break bulk industry with the stick cranes and the older style of mainly ro-ro cargo, military type cargo. We recently purchased a simulator in Philadelphia where we can simulate a gantry crane for container operation, forklift loading of a truck, driving of a yard tractor, and also operating a boom crane. I invited some of our labor partners to come to that simulator and actually run it for me. Of course, I had to go first, and I ran the container crane, and needless to say, I'm not running a container crane anytime soon. I didn't do too well, but they did say it was very realistic and very helpful. And where that can be very helpful to the employers is these employees can get a real feel for the equipment in a virtual setting and not have to be paid or insured. They can do it right at their hiring halls, right at their hiring centers. So there's definitely a fit for that moving forward. I know, speaking to John, they just ordered a simulator. I'm sure he could follow up on it. They ordered one in North Carolina. They got the Cadillac, we got the Chevy, but we're working towards the Cadillac. No disrespect to Chevy, but anyway, I hope that answers your question.
And I'd just like to add to that, when we were in the process of doing our bid proposal and evaluating what was out there, we actually went down the street, and there's a reserve component that has, in fact, a simulator by one of the major manufacturers in the United States for their military version of the reach stackers. So that was reassuring to see that, as we all know, the military stays on top of it and one step ahead. So we knew we were going in the right direction.
Craig Himes, NDTA. Bill, this question's for you, and it concerns inland waterways. If we're thinking about a contested environment and we want to be able to strategically maneuver and we want to give ourselves as much operational flexibility as we can have, what are your thoughts about the use of strategic waterways or inland waterways in the United States? You mentioned 38 out of 50 states that have waterways. And from my perspective as a former transporter, I don't think we use our waterways very much for deployment. So your thoughts about how we might do that in a way that would be efficient and effective for the military from an intermodal perspective?
Thanks, Greg, for the question. I would say that traditionally, the only time barges have been used have been for exercises at Fort Polk. And so I think about once a year, a couple times a year, we'll have exercise cargo move. I've seen it move not only on the Mississippi, but also on the Tenn-Tom. So it provides some operational flexibility. And based on what we talked about earlier today about keeping our enemy off their spot, it might be a scenario where this wouldn't necessarily be a fast moving, but if it was a deliberate move and you wanted to do it in an unconventional way, that would change the profile of that movement, that maneuver. So if you built that into maintaining a strategic surprise or strategic keep them off their center of gravity, then that might work not only for the inland system, but also for the intercoastal is another way of getting cargo, Texas up to New Orleans or over to Mobile or what have you. So I think if you just look at it from a business case and based on the tip fid, unless it's exercise cargo, it usually doesn't make that cut. But if you're looking at it in terms of providing flexibility and doing things in an unpredictable way, and you can build it into your rotation, then I think it's something to take a look at.
Just a quick comment for Bill and Craig on that last piece on the barge, just so you know, the barge movements we do are with the 101st Airborne, and so we just recently completed a barge move, about 40 barges worth of equipment, and that has been the method that we now use to move the 101st down to Fort Polk. One of the things I'd toss out to the group that I'm interested in is rail barges, and is that something that we can take a look at? I'm just starting to think about those things. I know there's some ports that do have that capability. I think that's something we could take a look at to maybe expand the aperture. If there's thoughts on that, please. Otherwise, making the comment for everybody.
I'm going to ask Jeff Flumigan to stand up and talk just a little bit about the rail barge effort that's going up in New York.
New York and New Jersey has had an active rail float system since probably 1870, 1880. You know, I think it would probably cook some people's minds if I told them the only way to get a boxcar from New Jersey to Brooklyn is either the rail float, which can take 18 at a time, or they have to go all the way to Albany, cross the Hudson, and come back down. And that's the standard route for moving most rail freight to the Bronx and to Brooklyn, and Long Island as well. But the rail float system has been very effective in moving stuff between New Jersey and Brooklyn. We have now 2 brand new rail floats, 18-car rail floats. We had 3 14-car rail floats that are just now being replaced. Hurricane Sandy wiped out several of the 14-car rail floats, as well as the 100-year-old lift bridge that was operating at Grenville Yards. And through an infra grant, the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey was able to replace that with a state-of-the-art lift bridge. And we're also working on some of the improvements over in Brooklyn so that freight cars can move. And the number of freight cars has been growing regularly over the last 5 or 6 years, you know, from numbers in the thousands to up around close to 30,000 rail cars in the last couple of years. So it's growing and it's active, and it beats digging a tunnel for $20 billion.
And if you'd be interested in best practices, sir, we could have Jeff garner that for you and share that with you. So.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Lori. I'm from the Port of Longview, Washington State. And my question is kind of referring to the barge and rail the barge is, as the military, maybe some of the ports here know, thought of going direct to rail, building unit trains with cargo going direct to rail from ship, if the port has the capability. Maybe a big no. We currently
Do you have an offer?
well, we have cargo wind blades. We build like over a 6,000 length unit train of blades direct to rail at port, and it's efficient. It saves the manufacturer, 30% on handling charges. Your damage rate goes down. Port risk goes down. The need for additional equipment is eliminated. So just a thought.
So the way I would translate that is to say that you may apparently have an interest in becoming or considered for a strategic port. And if that were the case, then I would ask you to get with your local gateway to help you shape your message. And then
Yes, and I have met with Jeremy. Hi, Jeremy. And so absolutely, we do have an interest. But I was just wondering if any port had ever considered doing that with military cargo.
So to your answer, at Corpus, I've got 60 miles of our own short line and engage in the same thing you do.
And in North Carolina, we have, like I said, on-dock rail, frequently moving military cargo in and out of the ports.
We do the same in Philadelphia. We have on-dock rail at both terminals, mainly the Tioga Marine Terminal and then as well as Packer Avenue. Lifting directly to the rail, we've done that for a number of years at Packer Avenue on steel. Tends to take a little longer just because it's a little, you have to be a little more careful with the people in the way of lifting it right on. So generally, if we were to do the rolling stock of the military, probably put it on the ground and roll it up on the rail, I would think. But then you need the spanner, so.
And San Diego has the same rail capability.
Anyone else?
I'll add a mulligan if that's all right. Just we talked a little bit earlier about training opportunities, and I would encourage, and I think SDDC and their relationship with the Deployment Support Command in is it Alabama, Birmingham, they can help sometimes facilitate training opportunities of mutual benefit, either National Guard or reserve units. Reserve commanders have training requirements as well to include mobility. or deployment tasks. And so sometimes you can get an MP company to go to a port on a Saturday or a Sunday and provide free training on real equipment for a chance to get to go on a really cool ship. So there are things, it doesn't always work out, but there are opportunities, and what that does is it helps that reserve commander meet some training objectives, but it also takes a little bit of stress off the active component, and it provides valuable hands-on training for labor and port management.
We've met our hour.
It strikes me to say thank you to all of you for what you've done. That one of my big takeaways here is just about the gateways, and for MARAD bringing in everybody, and for SDDC bringing in all the commanders, field commanders, and getting that discussion going on at the breaks is probably a really valuable thing. The training discussion is very valuable as well, and I take the point about having more of our partners who are on the stevedore side of the house, of the labor guys, which we deal with in other venues as well. So very good suggestions. We are going to take a networking break till